So we're going to teach this morning about the utterance gifts. As we said yesterday, the guy named Howard Carter had a revelation that the gifts could be broken down into threes. There's 9 gifts of the Spirit. So there's 3 revelation gifts: word of wisdom, word of knowledge, and discerning of spirits. There's 3 utterance gifts, which are prophecy, tongues, and interpretation of tongues, and then 3 power gifts, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But the utterance gifts, prophecy, tongues, and interpretation. What's unusual about these utterance gifts is they were the ones that the Corinthians were struggling with. There's no evidence at all in Paul's writing that he was concerned that the gifts may be false in any way, but he was correcting them on how they were using them. They didn't have a complete understanding of the purpose of the gift. And the purpose is to move the church forward. The purpose is to edify the whole church, not just the individual. All of these have the potential to be personally edifying. There's nothing better than being used by the Lord. That is edifying. That builds us up. And it's possible to lose sight of the larger purpose, and you're doing it for yourself. And that's what the Corinthians were doing. The reason he put in 1 Corinthians 13 is that the opposite of love is selfishness, and they had become selfish. And so anytime we speak for another, in the terms of us speaking on behalf of God, that's prophecy. It's an overarching word. It actually includes the word teaching, so that someone who's teaching under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit is technically prophesying. And so anything that he says or she says when she's teaching in the name of the Lord is judgeable, just the way you would judge prophecy. So we can judge teaching. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with saying, I don't agree with what this person is teaching. It's not being judgmental in the sense that Matthew 7:1 says we're not to judge. In fact, we need to judge, and we need to be discerning about teaching. So prophecy is speaking for another, speaking on behalf of another, and so included in that, when it was first introduced, prophecy came about this way. God was speaking audibly to the children of Israel, and they just about burrowed in the sand. They could not take it. They were petrified at the voice of God, and they begged God not to speak to them directly anymore. So he agreed that he would gear down, and he'd begin speaking through another, speaking through people, and speaking through Moses. But the moment he said that's what he was going to do, he automatically included the basis of judging, because once it comes through our filter, our flesh, our spirit, it gets changed. It can be changed. It can be hijacked. And so right away, he put conditions on it that it has to be judged. And so Paul had every right to confront the Corinthians. The way I understand the Corinthians is it wasn't a church anything like ours, or a church like a big assembly, a big mega church. Nelson and I got to walk around the old bones of Corinth last year. It was a fairly large city, but there was no one meeting place. They met in homes, and we know that they met in homes because it was forbidden they weren't even allowed to have basilicas or large gathering places. But they have found homes that would seat about 50 people, and they would have a baptistry, and they'd have some Christian symbols right in the mosaics, and so they would say that was a church, that was used as a church. We didn't see any of those. I would love to have seen them, but we do know that they had a system of elders who looked after these homes. Then they would have bishops who would look after the elders, or a group of homes, or a section of the city, so that there was a layers of authority. And one of those leaders wrote Paul and said that this place is going crazy. There's people who just won't stop speaking in tongues. Every meeting is all in tongues, and And even when they say grace at a meal, they say grace in tongues. And Paul was concerned that outsiders would think that they're crazy. So he wrote to them and began to put limits on, not on the Holy Spirit, but limits on their flesh and limits on their understanding. And one of the things that we see about prophecy and tongues and interpretation, they are listed in 1 Corinthians 12 as three of the gifts. They seem to be pretty attainable, pretty accessible to the average person. What you don't read in 1 Corinthians 12, 13, and 14 is any real mention of the revelation gifts. They weren't abusing discerning of spirits. They weren't abusing word of knowledge, word of wisdom. It's likely that most of them weren't experiencing those things. Some of the leaders were, but the average person probably wasn't. And then when it comes to power gifts, gifts of healing, gift of faith, working of miracles, no mention at all that those gifts were being abused. And the reason is probably the same as today, is they didn't hardly ever see those gifts in operation. They are not as attainable. You never really hear anyone really struggling with the gift of working of miracles. It just is very, very rare. It does happen. It tends to follow people who have ministries, who are apostolic or who are prophets. God takes all the gifts and he takes all the ministries and he brings them together, merges them. And so we do see them in some of the ministry operation, but the average person wasn't struggling with those gifts. And so we want to explore how these utterance gifts work in the New Testament.